Damn, it's my favorite part of that track, too, right at the bad time. I finally got it set up so that I can do two songs back-to-back, which took virtually no work, but I had to use a different program than I normally use. So, welcome, everybody. I am Ardwulf. Welcome to the Counter Clipping Show. We are here on Monday, August 16th, with... You can't see it because it's behind the microphone. That's amazing. War in Europe is what we're clipping today. This has been an ongoing project, so you won't be seeing War in Europe next week, I hope. But I decided I was going to pick it back up and clip some more of it because I would like to get it in a state where it is back in the box and ready to go, as opposed to stuck in this cube in loose trays. So, once again, welcome everybody to who is already here. The social media posts have already gone out. I remember to do it tonight, which is great. So, our topic tonight is magazine games, but before we get to that, let us say, first of all, we are drinking Lagavulin 16. This is one of my favorites. It's kind of expensive, so it's not an every day or even every week dram, if you will, but it's I like it. It's very good. Here in Ohio, it was on sale when I bought it at the low price of $93. So, but I was celebrating when I bought it, so that was why I justified it to myself. I think sometime in early September, I want to run down to Kentucky and actually pick up some scotch so that we can have a little bit more selection in the rotation. Bottled at 43%, distilled on and aged on the Isle of Isla, and needs a little bit of water, in my opinion. So, welcome to Grumbling Grognard, Carl at Wargame Boot Camp. I assume that's Carl Creeder. Todd Walter, Dale Brady, Robert Moffat, John Longshirt, Dave Minery is in the house, finally. After many, many months of I know he's been watching, but I don't think he's been able to catch it live. Matt Taylor, David Thompson. Stay tuned, David, because I got some news for you. Block Oddity, Stephen Roberts. Stigler is in the house. Kyle Reese. James Whitmer, Stephen Reynolds, Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials, a channel you should all be subscribed to. John Longshore says Stigler is obviously against magazine games. It's funny you should mention that, John, because Stigler's running a series of videos on magazine games, a specific magazine game right now, anyway. So check out Stigler's channel as well if you haven't already. Henry Sikorsky, Matt Taylor, if I haven't mentioned you, Krusty Captain, Mr. Thovote. I'm not sure how we're pronouncing that, but feel free to correct me. Jeffrey Wesovich, Charles Latorre, Jeff Anderson, Lee Grant, Ken Kloby, John Nolan, Krusty Captain, if I haven't mentioned you, and Lynn Pratt, who will be joining us for a special event here in Columbus, which you'll see. I can't talk about it right now, but you'll see video from the event when it occurs later on in the year. So, let's see. So we have a channel of the week, which this week is Hex to Hex. They're linked in the video description. Please check his channel out if you're interested in video coverage of the GOSS system. He is doing video coverage of the GOSS system, which a little bit of a sensitive topic for some folks is videos on the GOSS series. So But Hex to Hex, I think is his stuff is good. You should check it out. So, also, a couple other things of housekeeping work that I want to talk about. Didn't really get the sales stuff done, so that hasn't. I'm hoping to get that done in the next week or two. Let me put it that way. I keep saying we're going to done this weekend, and there's other things that need to get done before it can be done in real life. However, on the giveaway, I have not yet made a 100% decision on whether there is going to be a separate video for the giveaway. But what I am telling you is that if there is, it will launch next week, and if there isn't, we will do the giveaway of one game on this show next week. And I won't tell you anything about what it is other than that it is a war game, not a used war game. Let me put it that way. So stay tuned for that. And if that's successful, then we might do that more than once. We'll see, because, it's 4,000 subscribers. I had wanted to give away 4 games. So I will be giving away 4 games. We might do it one at a time, each one a week. So let's plan on that. The other piece of news is that I have arranged for a code for the Steam version of Pavlov's House. This is David Thompson's solitaire, States of Siege-esque, although there's quite a bit more going on than there is in a typical States of Siege game. Game on the subject of Pavlov's House. So if you want to see that live streamed with perhaps some inept explanation and bumbling play, tune in tomorrow night at 10 p.m. We're going to go for an hour, and we'll see how it goes. We may do a continuation of it. I don't know how far we'll get. I don't know. I have noodled with it a little bit, so I'm not going into it completely cold. So tune in for that. Now, it's at 10 p.m. instead of 8 p.m., which is a far more reasonable time, because there has been an initiative behind the scenes, as it were, to set up a little community of helpful wargame content creators. So if you are a wargame content creator, you have a YouTube channel with videos, or you run a blog or a podcast, or you have a website or whatever, please do get in touch with me at ardwulfslair@gmail.com. And we will get you hooked up with that bunch. By far the most of the invitees thus far have been folks with YouTube channels, but that's because I have a big list that I keep of wargaming YouTube channels. So anyway, so what other news do we have? The everything you always wanted to know about wargaming stream will be here on this channel at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Wednesday with Dan from No Enemies Here. Our subject this week will be unit scales, since that's a thing that we have brought up multiple, at least I've brought up multiple times, and we will discuss it in as much depth as we get to before we are distracted. So let's check up on the chat and see where we are. I may actually not get farther than these armored units tonight, because there's a lot of Soviet armored units. There's a lot of them. Crusty Captain mentions that he's been playing the Vivictus issue of Alexander in Persia, and says the component quality is impressive. So we'll get to this, because I did a tiny amount of homework tonight. Because I didn't want to forget any magazines. And I'm sure I've forgotten magazines, but I have a list of magazines, some of which I have nothing to say about, because I've never seen the magazines. But I don't have a strong opinion on Vivictus, because the only Vivictus issues I've seen have been the very early ones, where it was just, cardstock counters that were bound into the magazine and not actual counters. That is a thing that American war games got away from by about 1972 or 73, and Vivictus got started with that. So I believe their games have a higher component, considerably higher component standard now. And I know the magazine's still around. I have not seen a recent issue of it. So I'm catching up to the chat before we do everything else. Yeah, I mean, Ohio is not the worst place to buy scotch, but it's pretty far from the best place to buy scotch. I mean, pricing wise, it's more than California. It's more than California. I am saying that booze in general is more expensive in Ohio than it is in California. Most other things are more expensive in California, but not booze. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. Well, I suspect that it's because of the way liquor is sold in Ohio. But we could talk about that for an hour, and we would not hear anything that we haven't heard before. That is Tiger Monkey Beijing. Speaking of $93 on sale, the regular price is like $96, so I don't think it's a big sale or anything. Stigler gives us bad puns. Kevin Paulson, hello from Texas. John Longshire says the best magazine game that he recalls was SPI's World War I. Whenever I get the sale video out, there will be at least 2, and I think actually 3 copies of that. There's like a couple different ones. There's a magazine, there's a folio, and there's the mini folio, the Moments in History one. And I believe I have all 3 of them put in for the sale. None of them are mine. Trent Turner says hello from Fort Worth. Hi, Trent. Thanks for stopping by. That said, World War I is an interesting game. I guess we're talking about magazine games now. So I think the touchstone for magazine games for a lot of people, including myself, is going to be Strategy and Tactics magazine. It was the war game magazine, at least here in the United States, that has been around the longest. It has had the best market penetration. It was at one point kind of an axis around which a lot of the hobby revolved, and it's still around and still comes out with, I think, 6 issues a year. 4 or 6 issues a year anyway. I think it's 6. And, you know, some of those games hold up pretty well. World War I is another one of those games where I'm not 100% convinced that it's fun. Now, bear in mind I haven't played it, so bear that in mind. But I have watched Callendale's video on it, so I have some idea of what's going on with it. But I strongly suspect that there's something very interesting happening in that game. And I think Callendale's, if you watch his review of it, you'll come to the same conclusion. There's some really interesting design going on there. Not sure it's fun to play, but it also doesn't take a million years to play, so... Block Oddity asks, what is a war game? It looks... Here, I'll show you a war game. Here you go. Here's your war game. How about that? So, you asked. You got it. So, anyway. Darren Leveloff just found the channel. Darren, we have... it's funny you should mention that, since your new game, or new version of your game, it just came out from Worthington. I've got some video of the previous edition of it from C3I, Red Soviet Dawn. I always want to say Red Dawn, which would be bad. So, because it was bad. I know a lot of people like it. But Darren, thanks for stopping by. It's never too early for whiskey. It's 5 p.m. somewhere. It is 5 p.m. on the West Coast, so it's officially not too early. I am only going to go for an hour. I'm going to strictly limit myself to that for the Pavlov's House live stream, because it might also be live on Twitch if I can get that stupid thing working. We'll see. I may have to do some finagling to make it happen. So the reason that is able to occur tomorrow is because our regular game that has been happening on Tuesday is not occurring tomorrow. So this will be it is a one-shot thing. I might do Pavlov's House again, but this is not like a scheduled event or intended to be a regular event or anything like that. So Mo is here. Mo has a live stream tomorrow at 8 p.m., which is why mine is at 10. I figure he'll be done by then. I would like us to mildly coordinate in the sense of at least not stepping on each other's live streams. Us meaning everybody, not just Mo and myself. Alan Salazar, welcome back. Henry Sikorsky, if I haven't said hello. Battle for Germany. Was Battle for Germany a magazine game? I think it was. I thought it was. And that's definitely a game that's gotten a lot of traction, too, from the S&T days, right? But there's also a number of games that I think weren't properly... And I'm talking about SPI S&T years. And I've been critical of these because I think there's a lot of them that don't really hold up all that well. But there's also some games that were not properly appreciated in their day. One of those is the plot to assassinate Hitler. Another one is probably World War I, actually. Another one is probably Tito. Believe it or not, I've seen some people circling back to Tito in recent years. That is not a well-liked game historically. It was not... it's like the kind of game you see in a bargain bin for $1. Let me put it that way. So... Levin... 1976, Afghan struggles, 2001 to 2021. I mean, yeah, I could think of a couple, and there's probably more than I can think of. Offhand, you have Labyrinth, which is the whole war on terror globally, which starts in 2001, but you can go to almost today. And then there's A Distant Plain, which is the coin game on Afghanistan specifically, which is where I would recommend looking. But I don't necessarily... I haven't played Distant Plain in a long time, so I don't know that I could speak to its ability to reflect the events of the last several years, because it's not a brand new game anymore either, so... Matt Taylor mentions the only magazine game that he has is C3I's Gettysburg and Kursk 43. So, since we're now talking about other magazines, here are the magazines that I am aware of that are currently being published that include war games in every issue. Now, C3I is on that list. C3I, that is a relatively new development for C3I, right? It didn't always include games in the magazine, but the last 5 or 6 or 8 or whatever it's been issues have contained games in the magazine. And generally speaking, they've been pretty well received games. Soviet Dawn is one that I had. I actually ran that down as an out-of-print collectible item because I wanted the game. That's one of the few exceptions where I really wanted the game, as opposed, because I think Soviet Dawn's quite an interesting game, by the way. If you go watch the video, I have a whole playthrough series of it. It is a States of Siege game. It's very well done. It is... I'm not the world's biggest States of Siege nut, but it's a very good game. I liked it a lot, and the new version from Worthington looks really nice, as in terms of its physical presentation. So I'm being confirmed here that Battle for Germany was in the magazine, which does not surprise me at all. Another one that is still really well regarded is the SPI Cobra. That was relatively on the late side of, or was it? I'm not sure that it was. I think it was around mid-period SPI S&T, and that's been reprinted a number of times now. Decision has now done it twice. Yes, twice. TSR did it as well in a box version, and the TSR version is the version that started to include the Normandy landings in addition to Operation Cobra itself. So that's another classic that I would rank pretty highly in terms of S&T magazine games from the SPI era that I think are relatively well regarded nowadays. There are also a couple games in the Great Battles of the American Civil War system. I think the S&T ones are all pretty good, actually. Not all of them came out in the magazine. That's the thing. So it's tricky to say exactly which ones. I know Stonewall did, but Stonewall is like a semi-Great Battles of the American Civil War. Cedar Mountain definitely came out of the magazine. I know that because I have it. There's at least 1 or 2 more that came out in the magazine. Those are all pretty interesting, but they're all relatively small battles. I think if you're playing the bigger battles, I think you want the new version of the system that's out from GMT. So it's about time to refill. I've been going at this for like an hour now, actually. So I am reasonably pleased with my progress through the Soviet mechanized corps thus far. So Wilson's Creek, yeah, that's another one that was... There's also, in the SPI era, there's also Pea Ridge and Drive on Washington that were magazine-sized games. And I know that I have Pea Ridge in a boxed version, and I know that one of those games did not come out in a magazine version. It was only in the 1-inch box. There's also the Victory in the West system, which I should point out. Now, that system sort of originated with... I mean, a lot of the ideas come from Panzergruppe Guderian, okay, which is certainly an all-time classic, and people still play that. When I was at Compass Expo a couple of years, whenever the last Compass Expo was, there were people playing Panzergruppe Guderian in the S&T version, too. So, that's certainly an all-time classic. Victory in the West originates with Operation Typhoon, which is one of the big monsters, which is about Operation Typhoon, obviously. The German assault on Moscow in late 1941. But then the three smaller games that appeared in the magazine, there was Patton's Third Army, there was Operation Grenade, and there was Sicily Race to Messina. And once again, I point to Callendale, who has done playthrough video on all... To whatever extent one calls Callendale's video content a playthrough, it's sort of playthrough-ish. He has done video on all three of those games, and those are considered classics as well. And the system is so well-liked that it continues to have resurrections on a regular basis. Offhand, the Fall Blau game from Compass from a couple years ago uses that system. The Variable Combat series from MMP, which only has one game in it, which is their Salerno game, which is not actually well-regarded. But that uses that system. And then the very well-regarded Jaws of Victory from New England Simulations also uses a derivative, and some of the other stuff, Killing Ground and Overlord, also all use that Victory in the West system or something very close to it. And the sort of the signature feature of those is the undetermined unit strengths that are randomized. You never know until the unit starts fighting how well it is going to be fighting. And you draw the chits from a pool, and then you keep that chit under the counter. Stigler mentions Conquistador. I'm not really sure that is that well regarded. It's definitely I think it's a pretty interesting game. I went to the trouble of running one down. And it's also one of those that they felt confident enough at the time to pass it off to Avalon Hill as well, or Avalon Hill was confident enough to buy it. I actually ran down the Avalon Hill version because the Avalon Hill version has counters in the counter mix for the optional rolls that I believe are included in the original S&T version, but they didn't give you counters for things like the German explorers and stuff like that. So I am not convinced that everybody has as good an opinion on Conquistador as I do. So Ares Magazine is another one that's actually on the list. So let's talk about, briefly here, war game magazines that are still around being published today that include war games. If anybody has not heard, by the way, totally on topic for this too, Modern War Magazine from Decision Games has been canceled. Issue 55 will be the last version. The last issue. That will finish up the 7 Days to the Rhine series, and then they are going to call it a day. And it's just that it was not selling well enough and never had been, from what I understand. Let's catch up to the chat here. So another thing is that some of the like Ney versus Wellington, some people like that system. I know that was a S&T. I know. A lot of the quads are well regarded nowadays for various reasons. Not by me particularly, but I'm just some loudmouth on the internet after all. So, list of magazines. I guess we've already mentioned the soon-to-be canceled Modern War. There's the three from Decision. There's S&T, there's Modern War, and there's World at War magazine, which is all World War II. There's Paper Wars, now published by Compass Games. There's C3I, which is published by RBM Studios. What the history of that is, I don't know. So I will rely on somebody who's talked to Roger about it. At one point, it seemed like it was being published by GMT, but I'm not sure that was the case. It is definitely now being published directly by Roger. And historically, C3I didn't include games, but it has very often included materials for existing GMT games. And only in the last few issues has there been any level of serious coverage on games from anybody other than GMT. Somebody's talking about. So John Longshore says that back in the 70s, the games were better because you didn't have anything to compare them to. I think that there is a sense in which that is absolutely true. And we were less practiced at examining these things as well. So there's that, for whatever that's worth. So Joe Youst has done work for a lot of people, including GMT, but he's done a lot of work for Decision. And then there's Brian Youse, who is one of the big shots at MMP, not the same fellow. So, Mo's Game Table, use guys. Yins. I don't know if that's Pittsburgh as such, but it's that part of Pennsylvania. I've literally never heard anybody say that unless they were making fun of people from Pittsburgh, however. I believe it to be an actual thing. Yins. So, and I have a couple of the Modern War magazines, and I picked the ones up that were on topics that interested me. Stigler mentions... Okay, so in addition to the Decision games, the 3 magazines that they do, we have Paper Wars from Compass, we have C3I from RBM, we have Against the Odds, done by... I can't remember the name of the company, but it's not Against the Odds. And I think they do a couple issues a year, and they have a pretty high quality standard from what I've seen. I think I've got about 3 of their games. There's also Ya magazine from Flying Pig. Now I have seen it on the shelf on the rack at Mark's booth at Origins, and other than that, I have not examined the magazine at all. I know there's 6 or 7 issues of it. There's Battles magazine, which I believe contains the game, but I've never seen that anywhere except the internet. There's Vevictus, which is also, of course, if you don't know, in French. So all of the recent Vevictus magazine games that I have seen do have English rules available for download on the Vevictus website. Turning Point Simulations. Actually, I think... So, TPS is Turning Point Simulations, but I don't think that's the name of the company either. The name of the company, I have it because I have a couple of their games. If it ever comes up here. Well, that's irritating. The name of the company is... Oh, I can't find it. So, somebody will know it, and it's irrelevant. I think everybody knows them as Against the Odds. And then Turning Point Simulations, it might be run by the same people, but those are the boxed games. Those are the ones in those weird flat plastic trays. I might be able to get this in one compartment. So another thing, Alan Salazar mentions that even if they're not always maybe play-tested to destruction, because their volume is high, they can cover, and frankly, because they're relatively inexpensive to develop, because they come out once a month, or once every 2 months, or once a quarter, or whatever it is. They can cover topics that most publishers wouldn't want to do, like a full boxed game on with expensive production quality. Those trays, the Against the Odds trays, are trash. Those are terrible trays. I do not recommend the trays. I think you can buy them with or without the trays. I wouldn't bother with the trays. I would just buy a tray from GMT and get a mailer and put the game in. So LPS, that's the company I was thinking of, and that stands for something. I have it in here somewhere, and I can't remember what it is. But LPS, yeah, I do have it in here because, like I said, I've got 2 or 3 of their games. War Diary, yeah, that doesn't have a war game in it though. So I haven't actually. I've seen the magazine, but I've never seen it that it's included a game. Now, of course, there's also an extensive history of dead magazines that had war games in them. Pull my notes back up here. Big one, I feel like, and, part of this is selection bias, because I saw it a lot, played a number of the games that came out in it, and as far as I know, Command Magazine is still around in Japan. And a number of those... So, GMT situation on counter trays, this is what I recall. They had counter trays in back around Christmas, and now they're out of them again. That is, in fact, disappointing, I have to say. Certainly there are some companies that do not do a good job playtesting. That's unquestionably true. Now, the dynamic there is different. I didn't want to make an episode about playtesting. Maybe I should. The dynamic there is probably not what people think it is. It's probably the same dynamic that people think of when they're seeing, what about the complexity rating of this game versus this other thing that they did that is clearly more complicated. There's no guiding steering committee making these decisions, right? It's a publisher that is trying to coordinate a bunch of different individual development teams led by presumably designers in most cases, and there isn't a lot of centralized control. So when the designer says yes, the game is ready, then a lot of times the publishers are going to say, okay, well, the game is ready, so here we're going to push the button on publishing it. I'll have to look into War Diaries games. Another thing is that's Kyle Reese mentions the magazine itself. That's true. Even though, let's say, in the last 15 or 30 years, the quality of the games included in, for example, S&T, which is the one I have the most of, has been, let's say, inconsistent. The magazine articles have generally been very strong. The magazine is good and is worth reading if you're interested in military history. Even if maybe the games are let's be charitable and say hit and miss, and they're mostly miss, to be honest. But again, that depends. It's the same type of thing. I mean, there's a guy, that does a lot of games for Decision, but that's why he does a lot of games, because he can crank out 4 games a year on the magazine publication schedule. Sometimes you'll get a game like Harold Buchanan's Campaigns of 1777, and it will have clearly gone through a lot more playtesting and development than your average S&T game. So, all right, so David Imperato says War Diary gives you a free game through lock and load. Okay, like I said, I'll have to look into that. Playtesting might be a good episode, but what that would turn into in practical terms is a game of is a 2-hour bitch session of people complaining about such and such a game wasn't playtested. And I mean, not that would necessarily be unjustified, because in most cases those games probably were not thoroughly playtested, but I don't know that would necessarily make for interesting viewing, you know what I'm saying? So I think I can sort of talk about some of the GOSS playtesting that's happened, because I've followed that's one of the relatively rare topics on Console World that I actually do make it a point to follow, because there was a lot of good information that you kind of needed in there for a while. Atlantic Wall, for example, shows a lot of signs of being rushed among the GOSS series, particularly that landing sequence, which is mechanically poorly explained in the rulebook, and I think it's way too bloated for the amount of simulation value that you are actually getting out of it. I think I would have preferred that entire landing system to have been scrapped. and despite liking a lot of what the rest of the game is doing. Now, the airborne landing stuff works fine. It's a little time consuming for what it is, but but it's, you're playing GOSS. You're not signing up for tiddlywinks here, right? So one should expect that it is going to take you 2 or 3 hours to do the airborne landings. But I'm comfortable with that, right? But the beach landing sequence is this like completely bloated and ill-explained minigame. That was clearly tacked in at the last minute. It was clearly not play-tested very well, nor was the written explanation of it written very well in the actual book. So, I haven't really looked at the Killing Ground landing rules yet. I don't hate the ones from the Battle for Normandy, though. Which kind of makes you break it down into companies, which is kind of typical for a lot of those games, but it doesn't take too long. So you get like enough detail without getting too much detail in the landing. The worst crime, though, is too much detail and not enough simulation that you're gotten out of it as your upside. Now, I do think Stigler's going to laugh at me for saying this. I do think there is some effort at Decision Games going into trying to do a better job of playtesting their stuff. I'm not sure they really know how to do that, but I do believe an effort is being made. To what extent it is succeeding, I think, can only be properly judged from the quality of the finished product. And I have the last S&T I bought with a game was like 2 or 3 years ago. So Doug Sunset mentions Brandon Sanderson's discussion of good writing roofs. That's get reactions, not suggestions. I think that's probably a really good idea, actually. Because you can't do everything the playtesters want, right? Your playtesters might be disconnected from the kind of game you're trying to make. In which case, any specific suggestions they have made might not be useful to you. And if you adopt them, you might end up with some kind of schizophrenic design that doesn't serve either purpose as well as possible. John Sy, thanks for stopping by from lovely Manila. It is winter in Manila right now, though, so I don't know what the weather looks like in the winter in the Philippines. So we did, and I've mentioned this before, it's not a secret, and I was not asked to sign an NDA, so I will happily say, I won't tell you the details about the game, because I'm hoping they'll fix it before it is actually released. But we did a certain amount of playtesting for an upcoming Decision Games thing at some point in the last couple of years. I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but it was bad. Now, I think we were the only people to get... I think we were like the first people to see it, so there's that. But we did not come away with favorable impressions of the games. I am positive that winter in the Philippines beats winter in Cleveland. Greg Rant says GTS is the greatest day is the landing procedure. So, I don't disagree with that. However, what I will say is that the idea behind that landing process, and their air landing process is similar in GTS, is that the idea was that he wanted as few special rules just to deal with that as possible. So it kind of is built into, it uses the existing infrastructure in the game, and I think that's a laudable idea, even if it works a bit slowly in actual practice. I will absolutely agree with that. I understand that your food in the Philippines is outstanding too, so there's that. Now, I sort of can speak to the OCS Normandy, and it has the landing process in it is... I mean, you don't have like a super detailed landing process in OCS, and which I'm fine with. At that scale, I think that makes sense. But the OCS general landing rules, I think, work pretty much fine. having played them in Sicily, and Sicily too, for that matter. So, now I do think that Normandy, and I think we talked about this during the Normandy episode, I think almost any, it depends on the scale, right? For like Normandy 44, yes, there's a special landing procedure, but the special landing procedure takes 3 or 4, maybe 6 minutes to do. I don't need a day plus one scenario for Normandy 44. But for like a big Normandy game, like your Killing Ground and Overlord, or your Greatest Day, or your Longest Day, or your Day of Days, yes, I think there should be a post-landings scenario for those people who just don't want to deal with the landings and they just want to get to the actual campaign. I don't really have a problem with the OCS landing rules, to be honest, but I mean, it's not considered one of the clearest parts of the OCS rules. In part, I think, because there's virtually no games that use them. I mean, none of that East Front stuff. It can theoretically come up, but I've never seen it come up. So, I do think that there's a chance that they will polish that text a little bit. I think the rules work fine. If maybe that's a rougher part of the rule book than the rest of it, it's probably because of lack of use. Because only the Sicily games really are guaranteed to include. I guess, I think there's a special process for the landings in Reluctant Enemies, I believe. Cross-Channel Attack is the OCS Normandy game that is in development, which is June to September of 1944. So, see how far we get here. Now, I really kind of wish they keep doing these newbie-friendly OCS games, and they go out of print. You can't get them unless you want to pay $200. That's kind of irritating. Findle70 says it would be interesting for a Normandy game to see something like the Enemy Action Ardennes systems, where you have like a set of cards that give you the first turn results. That is a potentially interesting idea. Dan Holt's Great Crusade, though, is a very high-level game, as I recall. Like I said, I didn't object to his landing rules in the Battle for Normandy, but I mean, when you decide, hey, we're going to play the Battle for Normandy, you're setting yourself up for a giant project, right? I mean, it's a monster game. It's a big monster game at that. It's not even a small monster. It's a big monster. So the extra hour or two that you're adding at the beginning to do the landings is probably not much of a big deal. So Stephen Reynolds, I was actually going to mention this. Mark Herman has a YouTube channel. Please check that out. He is doing videos on his new version of Pacific War, which is coming from GMT. Pacific War, I'm repeating what Mark has said in the video, so this isn't news. Pacific War is done. GMT is sending it to the printer anytime, pretty much. If that has, in fact, not already occurred, which would be great if it has, because I would like to see it this year. That's. I think the chances of that actually occurring are dwindling at this time, but I would like to see it this year if possible. So in addition to the dead Command magazine, now a lot of those Command magazines have been redone in recent years. I mean, several by GMT. I think a couple have come back out from Compass, and anybody else? I think GMT and Compass have pretty much got the reprints of those. GMT has done the Ted Racer games, including 1914 Glory's End and When Eagles Fight, which are very good. There's the new 1918 Storm in the West. 1919 Storm in the West was a Command magazine game. Great War in Europe and Great War in the Near East were Ted Racer, Command magazine World War I games. Those came back out in a deluxe edition a number of years ago now from GMT, and that's a nice game still. And it has it goes for decent change on the secondary market. Let me put it that way. All right, I dropped a counter. Pretty sure. There we go. In addition to that, I know a couple have come out from Compass. And then there's the Wargamer. I've got one, I think, one issue of the Wargamer. Henry, GMT's updates keep saying we're going to send it to the printer next month. So their June update said it was going to go to the printer in July. And the July update said it should go to the printer in the next couple of weeks, which would have been in July. So, oops. So, not to hold their feet to the fire particularly, I mean, the global logistics chains are in the toilet right now. So, if stuff's late, it's pretty far from GMT's fault. But, I wasn't aware of this until relatively recently, and I think Justagard may have been the person to point this out to me, actually, is that a bunch of the relatively recent Paper Wars games are old magazine games from elsewhere. So there's also Ares magazine, which was mentioned, which was S&T's sci-fi game. Of course, when SPI went into the dumper and was taken over by TSR, TSR actually kept both magazines around. But they kept Ares magazine around for 3 or 4 issues, I believe, and they kept putting games in them. Then they folded Ares magazine into Dragon magazine, and it was much diminished in every possible respect, including, obviously, no longer including a game. Now, S&T kept including games, but TSR, within about 2 years, as I recall, they had dumped S&T off to 3W. 3W had it for 2 or 3 years, and then they sold it to Decision, and Decision has had it since then. So it's interesting to say that Decision has owned and has been publishing S&T for more issues than everybody else put together, including SPI. So John Longshore, there is a paper shortage too, among other things. There's a paper shortage too. The only thing there is that it hasn't hit the price schedule yet, because these things spend months in a production queue somewhere when the pricing might have been determined some months ago. One Small Step Games did issue a couple new Ares issues, but it's not a regular thing. I might have to look into that. I think I only own one game from One Small Step, and it is the new version of War and Peace. And they have a number of things that look interesting. And I just haven't pushed the button on any of that stuff. I mean, right now, to be blunt, storage has become an issue. It's because of the layout here and the way storage works. I'm working on it, right? But I don't have a solution completely materialized yet. So Kaiser Bill, please do not mention places where you can get pirated copies of people's intellectual property. Please do not ever mention that on this channel. You can get the channel in trouble by doing so. So if you do that, anybody does that again, I will remove the comment, and if you want to persist on it, I will ban you from the channel. So please do not. You will get me in trouble from YouTube. So you want to have whatever discussions and whatever websites you want somewhere else, feel free. So sorry to be a dick about that, but those are the rules. YouTube's rules, not my rules. All right, I don't know about the DVD Alan Salazar's mentioning. I'm going to remove that too. I don't know if that's legit, so let's not. Ares was a good magazine. I think Ares was... I mean, the magazine was really good. And actually, I think SPI was doing some really interesting science fiction stuff. So... I have not really been hit badly on the shipping delays either for war games, but for role-playing stuff I have. Not that I buy a lot of role-playing. When I say role-playing stuff, I mean Traveler stuff, so we're clear. And everything that I've ordered has been domestic except for the Traveler stuff, which is printed presumably in China. And spent a lot of time in customs. I did get my Deep Night Revelation stuff. Finally, so hopefully we'll see a video on that. I do apologize to anybody. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings on the thing, but do not mention places to get pirated stuff on YouTube unless you want to get the channel banned. So if YouTube thinks that a channel is being used as a place to disseminate information on places where you can get pirated stuff that is people's intellectual property, whether it's really anybody's intellectual property or not, they will come down on me. So I will not allow it. I cannot allow it. So I'm sorry. That's just the way it is. Mongoose depends. If it's like so I suspect that the delay there is on Mongoose's side. If it's something that's in their warehouse, they do have a U.S. warehouse, then you'll get it pretty quickly. If it's something that is like not printed yet and has to come over from China, then A, it has to get printed in China. B, it has to get on a boat, it has to come over here. The boat has to get checked into customs, and then it may sit in customs for a whole lot of time. I still have at least one book out from Mongoose that I have not yet received. Thanks to customs delays. So as far as I'm aware, there's no prohibition on selling your own kidney on YouTube. So Jeff Beeler asks, what SPI S&T games were eventually bought by Avalon Hill? Well, two have already been mentioned that I could. But so several things. Avalon Hill was fairly aggressive at buying games from other people, and in some cases buying the people. They pretty much bought Battle Line, Lock, Stock, and Barrel, for example, and virtually everything that Battle Line did eventually made its way back out in some form from Avalon Hill. Not everything, but almost all of it did. They, of course, bought 3M. If you're familiar with the people that make the tape, 3M, yes, they had a line of board games at one point. Same company. That line was eventually sold to Avalon Hill and included things like Twixt and Facts in 5 and Acquire and a bunch of other stuff. Yes, times are tough, so kidneys for sale. Video will be up for body parts next week. So Avalon Hill bought a bunch of stuff from a bunch of companies. I mean, they weren't the original publishers of Diplomacy. They weren't the original publishers of Civilization. They weren't the original publishers of a lot of stuff that they did, to be honest about it. So Freedom of the Galaxy was not a magazine game, but it was an SPI. Well, here we go. Freedom of the Galaxy. SPI. There's a really nice condition. Well, I don't know about nice condition. There's a copy that last I looked on eBay of this, the SPI edition, for a reasonable price. So if you're in the market, shoot over to eBay and check it out. So Frederick the Great was one. Frederick the Great was a magazine game, but it was also released. I think it was, but it was also released in a flat tray at least. I don't recall that Freedom of the Galaxy was ever in a flat tray. Panzergruppe Guderian is another one that Avalon Hill picked up. Panzerkrieg. They picked up some stuff from OSG, too, including Panzerkrieg and Napoleon at Bay. Both of which were originally OSG, and then Avalon Hill picked them up, and now Napoleon at Bay is back out, well, several years ago. Kingmaker's another one. AFDL. Stigler, that's not springing to mind, whatever that is. Africa Corps, however, is another one that was not originally from Russian campaigns. Another one that was not originally... Wait, it might have been Africa Corps was, actually. Russian campaign was originally Jedco. Panzer Blitz was originally an S&T game under a different name. Air Force and Dauntless were from Battle Line. There was from Battle Line, and of course, by the way, Stigler's got a How to Play video on Flat Top, which is one of the all-time classics. We talk about it all the time on this channel. That was originally from Battle Line as well. So, and the Battle Line counters, of course, had those super thick counters. France 1940 was a Dunnigan design. I think it was an S&T game. I think so. Panzer Army Africa, I'm not sure about. Ugh. But of course, Conquistador. Robert Moffat mentions submarine. I always want to think of U-boat when that comes up. So, whoops. Hope we're getting this straight. So there was a lot. Oh yeah, actually, the original edition of Titan was from somebody else too, but I'm not sure that that was a professional publication. I think that might have been a self-publication by Dave Trampier and his co-designer on that game. Third Reich is originally Avalon Hill. 1776, as far as I'm aware, was 1776 is Mark McLaughlin design. Perfidious Albion mentions the Yaquinto album games, and that was actually sort of an interesting idea. Not really an optimal storage system. Brant, thanks for stopping by. Mark Herman. Is that the Mark Herman? Hopefully that's the Mark Herman. Panzer Army Africa was an S&T game. Well, if Mark Herman says so, then it was. That's the way it was. I don't think that I recall seeing a full game in the general. Even their inclusion of counter sheets was later on. So and I really like Titan 2 actually. But Flat Top is one of my all-time favorites. So Mark, I have recommended that people go check out your new videos on Pacific War. So, highest possible recommendations on that. Please do more. Please keep them coming. So, I'll be happy to watch them multiple times. I have watched each of them multiple times already. So, I'm super excited. I guess we'll digress on that for a minute. Not originally an S&T game. But I'm super excited. I said this at the beginning of the year that Pacific War was like very high on the list of most anticipated games, and hopefully it'll actually make it out this year. So don't be shocked if it doesn't, given the delays in shipping and production and all that stuff. So I will not be stunned should that occur, but I am hoping to have it in my hands by the end of the year, and I am going to buck like crazy to get it to our table very quickly once it does arrive, and once I take a month to clip and organize it, so because it's big. Yeah, the teaching video with Fred on Fred's channel was on Saturday. You should be able to watch the replay of that now. It's very good. Empire of the Sun is, of course, also not an S&T game, but Empire of the Sun is an absolute masterpiece of wargame design. I say that without any form of hesitation. It is a wonderful game, and the walkthrough that Mark did with Fred and them was I think really valuable for those of us who do not get to play as much Empire of the Sun as we would like. So. I never played either submarine or U-boat. U-boat was one of the super duper early 60s ones in the super old school box from Avalon Hill, and I think that was theirs. Pacific War is in China. Well, that's cool. If it's already at the printers, that's even better. I mean, it's not like you got to mail stuff to them anymore, right? So that's going to speed things up by some amount of time. I'm more concerned about delays in crossing the water and in delays in getting through customs once it has hit American shores. So, Bomba from Yaquinto uses the same engine as Flat Top and CV. I might have to look into that if that's the case. Definitely not. I am reasonably certain that I have owned a Yaquinto game or two at some point in the past, but I am equally certain that I do not own any Yaquinto games now. Fast carriers. I actually was looking into fast carriers not that long ago. That would be interesting. It would be an interesting game to take a look at. That old chestnut says it's much easier to play the Japanese if you don't have to go to war with the United States. That's certainly true. But then if the United States can go to war with you anyway, then what's the point? You got to fight them one way or the other. And there, I mean, I think, timing aside, the United States and Japan were on a collision course to war in late 1941, and war was essentially inevitable unless one side or the other was going to back down, and neither side was going to back down without war occurring. So, Ironclad. I think that was a Yaquinto game, yeah. I want to especially hear about other S&T games that I should run down, particularly, and I have a couple from the TSR era and a couple from the 3W, one or two from the 3W era, and a double handful from the Decision era. And so the ones that I have from the Decision era are the 4 Italian campaign games. Okay, so let's nip this in the bud. So Yaquinto's Panzer, Armor, and 88. So it was Panzer, and then Armor and 88 were separate games that I think expanded Panzer. That is the same David Day Panzer system that is in print from GW now. It's reorganized into a different set of boxes. But the 88 was the North Africa one, and that's the one that's coming from GMT. Henry asks, what's the difference between Mark Herman's Pacific War from GMT and the one from Compass Games? Well, the one from Compass Games is not Pacific War from Mark Herman. Presumably you are talking about The War, The Pacific, or The War Pacific, which should be out from Compass reasonably soon. That is the companion Pacific game to The War Europe, which is well liked by the people who have played it. I think it's not being done any favors by its title, which makes it very, very difficult to actually search for unless you know exactly where you are looking. So whereas the Victory Games Pacific War is really an operational game and not a strategic game, although there's a strategic scenario where you can play out the entire Pacific War if you want. So yeah, Mo's got it right here. The War of the Pacific. I really feel like those two games are not being done any favors by their titles. That they're impossible to search on. When you say them out loud, they come off as confusing. A lot of people have become confused by that. Now, Compass also has a couple things in the pipeline, one of which is called either Under the Southern Cross or Beneath the Southern Cross, which is kind of a flat top on steroids type of system. That's a ways away yet. They also have a new version of Carrier, of the Victory Games Carrier from the original designer. And it's Carrier Battles Philippine Sea. It's a different battle, but it's the same system. So, alright, yeah, totally different designer, totally different game. I would expect zero correspondence between those two projects. Now, I do think there's value. I don't want to sound dismissive of the War Pacific, right? It might be great. I don't know. I've heard good things about it, and I want to see it. But and I think there's value in playing different games on the same subject because they're going to teach you different things. The designers almost certainly, if they're good designers, the designers almost certainly had different things to say about the topic. Now, I do remember Operation Olympic, the plot to assassinate Hitler. I have already. That's, I think, one of those underappreciated games that maybe also didn't get the development that it needed. Ugh. So, Perfidious Albion says that the decision games war in the Pacific is too big and unmanageable. So, yes, that's true. However, there's the problems with that particular example are deeper than being large. Because there are people who are willing to sit down and play large games. If nothing else, they can go to Console World Expo or someplace like that, or WBC or wherever, and play a game that takes all week. There's people willing to do that, and I would be delighted. I'm always happy to do that kind of thing. But so that's a challenge, right? It's and it also represents a playtesting challenge because the game is big. It takes a long time. It's harder to playtest. That is definitely a challenge when it comes to developing those games. That doesn't necessarily mean that those games are not playtested. Some people will tell you that that's what that means. I'm thinking of Lou Pulsifer, who has directly said that, and he is frankly wrong. But it is definitely true that it is challenging to playtest big games. I mean, I think the designers or somebody involved with it admitted at one point that the SPI War in the Pacific was not really playtested particularly well. And I don't think that would shock anyone. They playtested one of the scenarios fairly thoroughly, but they didn't playtest the entire campaign. And I am going to guess, and I think I'm probably right, that the Decision War in the Pacific is probably the same type of thing, where they probably playtested the scenarios to a certain extent, but they probably didn't playtest the campaign at all. Because it's probably the biggest game, not just ever, but the biggest game possible. So, for one thing, the Decision War in the Pacific is not really the same game as the SPI War in the Pacific. There's a lot of huge and substantial changes to the mechanics, not just the other stuff I'm about to tell you. One of the other things that the Decision War in the Pacific does is it has this telescoping scale where you have these tactical maps on which you fight the battles for the individual islands in the Pacific. Now, that sounds cool, but the fact is that these islands range from tiny barren rocks to huge islands. Like Guadalcanal is a pretty big island. Okinawa is a pretty big island. The massive. So the scales, there's like 6 or 7 different scales of hex map on these islands. And so what you have is this telescoping unit scale where you could break basically anything down from divisions, at least down to battalions and maybe down to companies. And when you're looking, from a certain perspective, that makes sense. But then when you're looking at making sure that the game actually functions properly on all these scales, which I do not believe for a moment was actually done, and then how does that impact playtime, right? So you might be able to get meaningful play out of some of the scenarios of the Decision Pacific War, but the campaign is, I think, a paperweight. I say this as somebody who plays monster games routinely, who said, yes, we can accommodate Case Blue over in this person's basement. And let's do that. I'm excited about that. And it took us a while to play. Who has spent a year plus playing these things sometimes. I do not believe the Decision War in the Pacific campaign to be playable. The SPI War in the Pacific campaign, I think, is probably playable. I think it may or may not be worth your time, because it is a lot of your time. But I think it is actually fundamentally playable. Unlike the Decision one, which I believe to be a novelty item. Yeah, so Old Chestnut, I hit that too. Beneath the Southern Cross is... So there's a Southern Cross thing coming from GMT, which is the next game in the Flying Colors series. So I'm buying that. That's cool. I love that series. But then there's the Southern Cross thing from Compass that's coming and I get them mixed up. So I am not going to tell you which one is which without looking it up, and I don't want to look it up in the middle of the stream. So, let's see here. Now, the question is, can I fit all of these counters? Where's my tweezers? Can I fit all these counters in these compartments? because I'm going with a counter tray, a GMT counter tray. Lockout, he says War in the Pacific was tested in the 1940s. I suppose that's true. I don't think there's a full island map of New Guinea, though. I could be wrong because I don't have it, and I'm not buying it. Don't think that I haven't been tempted, especially if I see it for a good price. But I mean, it's a game that retails from Decision for north of $400, and that's really expensive. I mean, and again, I've also spent a decent amount of money on some of these things, but boy, $400 is an awful lot. Flight of the Gerben. I don't know that that's a classic. So I think Gilbert Collins may have some video on Flight of the Gerben, actually. It's another one of those pretty interesting games. I'd be very curious to look it up. I'm not doing that right now. Magazine games. Well, we did mention the recent C3I magazines, which do include 4. So I'd be curious to know how many C3I full magazine games there have been. That number is at least 4, because at least 4 of them are by Mark. There's the Gettysburg and Waterloo games, and I do like the Waterloo game quite a bit. And then there's the 2 either add-ons or alternate scenarios, Plan Orange and South Pacific for Empire of the Sun. And both of those are obviously very much worth having. However, if you have the new edition of Empire of the Sun, then you got all the stuff you need for South Pacific, at least. War in Europe does not use a similar system to War in the Pacific. So even the land system, I think, is noticeably different. John... Mark says that War in the Pacific was late and got very little playtesting. The campaign was never tested. That lines up with what I've heard, and it is not entirely improbable that what I have heard actually came from Mark anyway. So, So Darren Leveloff mentions he's got some very interesting S&T games from the post-SPI era are Far Seas, Russo-Turkish War, Reinforce the Right, First Afghan War, Red Dragon Rising, and Franco-Prussian War. So I believe that Franco-Prussian War would be different than the SPI Franco-Prussian War. Very interesting. Henry, I think the actual retail MSRP on that is like $450 or $460 or something like that. It is. I mean, you're getting to be fair, you are getting an absolutely preposterous amount of stuff in that box. But, it's super expensive, and I don't know that you're getting a playable game out of it. You can get now, not to say that every copy that you'll see on eBay will be in this price neighborhood, but I'll tell you what I paid. I have an unpunched War in the Pacific. Now, I mentioned at one point that it is missing a counter. But the owner didn't know that, and I didn't know that, so I considered the price that I paid to be valid. And the box is not in amazing shape. The box is fairly beat up. I paid $260. So bear that in mind. That's really expensive, frankly. But it is a huge game. It has been out of print for 40 years. So, I didn't feel like I could meaningfully complain at that price. And it, I bought it at a time that was good for me too. Where this, on the other hand, was a fruits of a sale. So, Perfidious Albion says, are there any decent games on the East African campaign 1914 to 18 and the exploits of Paul Letow Vorbeck? So, there's a couple. There's not a lot, but there's a couple. There's Letow Vorbeck from Decision. That's the one I have. There's also I in no sense do I feel that this is a good platform for play of this particular situation. But we looked at it the other day, and there is, in fact, a module for using Europa to play out World War I in East Africa. in the in the, what was it called? The First World War module, which is the sort of First World Warized Europa, called Over There. They did 2 volumes in the series. I forget what they're basically the first 2 halves of the Western Front. And where are these going? Oh, there's more. Okay, great. More mech corps. These are actually mech brigades. Yeah, I felt like that too. It is expensive, but considering all other things being equal, I was okay with it. I was a bit miffed that it was missing a counter. However, the counter that it is missing is not like the Enterprise or something. It is a generic Japanese brigade. So it's not exactly a world-ending catastrophe. So bear that in mind. So let me mention again, because I don't want to miss mentioning it at the end of the show. Next week's counterclipping show, expect there to be a giveaway. And in fact, the more I think about it, the more I think about how great it would be to have a giveaway in the next several counterclipping shows, because I have 4 games to give away. So we'll see how that all works out. ATO Guns of the Ascari, that's another one that I think is World War I in East Africa. Sideshow, the campaign for German East Africa from S&T. I mean, this is kind of a topic that fits very neatly in the S&T space, right? Jeff Beeler asks about Nordkap, World War III in the north of Norway. Be interesting to compare that to Deadly Northern Lights, too, I suppose. John Longshore, the Letau Vorbeck game, which is called Letau Vorbeck, is the Decision Games folio that I am talking about, that I have. Carl, Working Boot Camp, Almost a Miracle, the Revolutionary War from Decision, and that is a big game. Should be Advanced Pacific Theater of Operations. Huge difference there. Advanced PCO is definitely big. I mean, it's 2 maps. It's footprint-wise, I don't know that it's that big necessarily, but it's got a monster rulebook. And a pretty decent number of counters, too. I mean, a 2-map game can be not a monster game, or it can be a huge monster game. 2 maps is one of those, it's in a gray area. It really depends on the game. NATO, the Compass Games, and Decision Games, NATO, that we're talking about so much lately, is 2 maps. It's really not a monster game. We should be able to play it in 3 weeks. Total of maybe 8 hours, something like that. And, we're not exactly moving lightning fast. So I don't think that's and it's a decent number of counters, too. It's got 4 counter sheets. They're 9/16-inch counters, so they're a little bigger than normally. Oh, John. If you win, I might ask you to help out with the shipping. Let me put it that way. If you're offshore, I'm going to ask you to help out with the shipping, because shipping offshore is ridiculously expensive. I think the one I was thinking of was that Schutztruppe. East African Guerrilla Warfare, 1914 to 1918. That's a really interesting topic, actually, is the World War I in German East Africa, and very much forgotten about. Battle of Tonga, yep. Now, what I will say about NATO is that there's not a lot of scalability in the scenarios. What you have is a small introductory scenario that you could play very easily on 1 map, but then you have everything else as a variant of the campaign. But the campaign, that said, you can play the campaign in a long sitting, too. So as long as you can accommodate the 2 maps, there is a small amount of off-map displays for the reinforcements, but not much. So, there you go. That is even better. That's the person who's putting together a cargo container for you for transport to the Philippines. What's up? What do you mean? It's the shirt. It's art, man. What can I say? I don't know. I imagine this shirt was designed by Roger McGowan, I would think. I guess I don't know that. Stigler, I'm finding 3 pound boxes go to Canada for $40 to $60, and that's crazy. So, I don't know that we can walk the chem strikes back, by the way. Well, we can always add the points up afterwards. We did retaliate, we meaning NATO, did retaliate with chem on the first turn too, which, had I known how the victory points would shake out, I would not probably have done that, but I'm pretty happy with the results of the first turn as NATO, to be honest. The Soviets did make some progress, but they didn't make a huge amount of progress. We played the War of Nerves scenario, and NATO was really twitchy. So we had NATO up to, I think, alert level 3 or 4. Might have even been 4. And the Warsaw Pact at that point was just like, we gotta go. It doesn't matter. We gotta go. So I'm very pleased with, and I think the rest of the group is, generally speaking, very pleased with NATO as well. I think I'm finishing these few mech brigades and then calling progress on War in Europe complete for the evening. I really like the War of Nerves. The whole War of Nerves setup takes you maybe 20 minutes to do, and I think it's really neat. It's kind of a building in a variable scenario start mechanism. It's really quite nice. I know Bruce is super duper excited about Air and Armor too, so. David Imparito mentions Guns of the Ascari again. We mentioned them up thread a little bit, but Jeff Beeler mentions S&T doing a series on South American wars that are interesting because they combine naval and land campaigns. War of the Pacific. There is another game called War in the Pacific too, by the way, so an unrelated. I mean, it's on the same topic, but then there's War of the Pacific, and the Triple Alliance War thing, which I had heard about. So that's interesting. I have. So here's my. After playing it for 2 weeks and not having a finalized opinion, I have a real positive opinion of NATO. There are 2 things I would complain about. One is this very small amount of errata. There's not very much, but there is a tiny amount of errata. It's a who cares level of errata. The one thing is I think the markers are not as good as they could be. There is a number of markers with like a tiny icon and an explosion of some kind, and there's at least 4, maybe 6 different ones that you have to then figure out what it is. And I would have preferred that there just be like suppressed on one of those counters, for example, to tell us what it is rather than trying to figure out which kind of explosion that it is. That is also a really, really minor complaint. So the little bit of graphic design improvement on the markers, the unit counters are absolutely 100% totally fine. Pitt's War and Paper Wars is one of the few Napoleonic strategic games that cover the Revolutionary Wars as well. Nathan Landrum mentions that. I have Pitt's War, and I haven't looked at it closely enough to know. I do know that it has a map that is very similar to the map for Napoleon against Europe, which is a recent acquisition on my side here. And actually, that's the only I almost said episode. That's the only issue of Paper Wars that I own or have looked at. I believe Ty Bomba is now running Paper Wars, so hopefully he can bring some of his considerable experience to the table in improving that magazine. But I do think Pitt's War looks good. So the other recent one I was interested in, but I haven't picked up, and I still might. Was the Galicia 1914 game that Justagard did video on. All right. So my next question is it totally impossible for me to get all these markers in that compartment? I believe that it is. So we'll do what we can. These are relatively new tweezers. These are the illuminated tweezers. They're made by General. You can get them from Amazon. They come with a silly little flashlight that I took off immediately because it was cheesy. So if I am playing in a situation where I need extra light from the tweezers, then the room does not have enough light, and I need to play somewhere else. I have relatively bad eyes, and I can handle small things generally okay, but if the lighting's bad, not a fan at all. So I am prepared to be a stickler about having good lighting. And we have dropped. Now I did take a pair of pliers and bend. I don't know how well you could see that. And bend the tips inward so that you can pick up counters of different thicknesses, which is absolutely something that one has to be concerned about when you're talking about old SPI counters. The Grenadier. Did every issue of the Grenadier have a game in it, or most issues at least? Spanish Civil War is another interesting topic that No Parasan is, or No Pasaran, or I don't know how to pronounce that. But that is a game on the Spanish Civil War that sort of uses the Europa system, and then later on, GRD released For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is the sort of full treatment in Europa of Spain and Portugal should they enter the war, and the Spanish Civil War is sort of an additional thing to add value to the game, because otherwise you'd have nothing to play out of that box. It's just like an addition to whatever Europa thing you might have going on, and then it might not even Spain and Portugal might not enter the war. So the suction tweezers are super. I've never used them. They seem super weird. So maybe they're great. I don't know. But I've got enough regular tweezers, and I'm reasonably happy with them. My thought on this was that I was going to get all of the Soviets into one counter tray. And I no longer believe I can do that, since I found several additional compartments of these Soviet mech brigades. I would be happy to just use the original SPI counter trays. However, they are 40 years old and disintegrating. So I think that would be ill-advised, so I'm going to use GMT trays instead. I'm going to need to clear one compartment. I think I can do it, but I got to figure out how they're going to fit. I mean, here's the original tray. There's still a lot of counters in there. And here's the GMT tray, and it's almost full. And in some cases, it's like full to the point of tension on the lid. So, Henry, I have no idea. But I'm going to guess, however, and say that their ability to get counter trays in stock are going to be impacted by the same production and logistical challenges that are affecting so many other things right now. So, A, I have no idea, and B, they may be having problems getting them in stock. They, for all I know, GMT thought they were going to be in stock 6 months ago, and they're not for whatever logistical reason. So that is possible. Try to be understanding. No, there's a lot more than that, actually. They are generic. They are cookie cutter units, but at that scale, maybe that's fine. But it's kind of not. But they are cookie cutter units, and it does simplify play a bit at that like size. No, I do not have the World War I expansion, and it goes for a shit ton of money. So no thanks. I am not interested in it for what it costs. Nor do I think that's I don't think that's particularly interesting. I think there are a lot of other alternatives to World War One that I don't need to deal with War in Europe scale to play through. I can, I think the Storm of Steel from Decision I think is worthwhile. The Der Weltkrieg, if you really wanted to be on that scale, Der Weltkrieg scale is not that different from War in Europe. Matt Taylor mentions 3D printing custom counter trees. There are folks doing that, actually, and it's probably not cheaper than buying $3 counter trays from GMT, I'm guessing. Not even counting the cost of the printer. So, Stegler says the World War I module sucks. I don't know if he's right or not, but what I can tell you is I am insufficiently interested enough in it to really seriously look at it, unless it was something that I could get cheaply, and you can't. So... Perfidious Albion asks about... We're talking about World War I relevant stuff now. I guess we're a week late on that, but that's okay. Second edition Triumph of Chaos. It is an absolutely beautifully produced game from a component quality standpoint. There is an absolutely shameful amount of errata to go with it. There is this entire book of errata that will have you replacing cards and counters and making corrections on the maps and all kinds of stuff. It's an absolute embarrassment. Now, it has such a strong reputation as the definitive game on the Russian Civil War that I think it is, and I've had people tell me this, that it's worth dealing with that. And that might be true. I am not getting rid of mine. It is considered the definitive game on the subject for those people who are into games on the subject, with the caveat that there's not that many games that cover the Russian Civil War, that cover the whole Russian Civil War, right? There's games that deal with individual engagements and topics and stuff like that. But there's only like 10 or so games that cover the whole conflict, and I have 9 of them. The only one I don't have is the Azure Wish game, because nobody can get that. So, unless you want to spend $1 million. So the DG Storm of Steel is a vastly different scale than War in Europe, though. I mean, it's a 3-map game to cover basically the East Front, the West Front, and the Middle East are kind of the 3 maps. And does it use some of the same concepts? Yeah, I think it does, but it also brings a lot of stuff in from like Krieg games and stuff like that. So so Stigler's talking about the World War I War in Europe module. Yeah, I don't doubt that it has problems, but frankly, the World War II game in War in Europe has problems, right? You got to kind of roll with the punches on that. So there is a Against the Odds magazine game on the Russian Civil War called For Bloody Honor, which is a pretty good reputation, and which I have. So another Stuka Joe, thanks for stopping by. So another thing with magazine games, and Stuka Joe has pointed this out in various places, is that they also tend not to be games that necessarily suck up tons of your time. They tend to be relatively playable in a small-ish footprint, in a small-ish amount of time. And maybe you don't play them 30 times, but you play them once or twice, and you only paid $30 or $40 for it in the first place. So in that context, even if your magazine game is maybe not the most tightly developed thing ever, maybe you're willing to deal with that because you're going to get, your 10 hours of entertainment out of it, and you'll have paid $4 an hour for that and be happy. That's a reasonable position to take, I think. Stigler, I would suggest that some might argue, I'm not sure that I would, that the Schlieffen plan was doomed from the beginning. Not least because the plan that was actually executed was not the actual Schlieffen plan. They pulled some divisions away and didn't attack with as much force as the original Schlieffen plan called for. So Stuka Joe is saying, somewhat humorously, I think, that if you want to be in the shoes of the developer, and you kind of want this mostly finished product to practice on, that magazine games might be good for you. And there's certainly there are examples of games where they have had problems, and yet I have felt like it was worth dealing with the problems to play the game. That's been true of magazine games. That has been true of boxed games. That's certainly true of the GOSS games. When I started getting into GOSS was very difficult to deal with, because we still had the old shitty rule book. So, Mike Anthony, yes, I have mentioned that the final episode, the final issue of Modern War magazine will be issue number 55. They will finish the 7 Days to the Rhine series. So, fabulous whiskey. Anyway, I will say that the more I drink of it, the less peaty I think it is, and that sounds weird in comparison to other peaty whiskeys. The peatiness of Lafroig doesn't seem to fade quite as much as this. Then again, Lafroig is peatier than this, so there's that. I would love to see a copy of Le Grand Guerre, but it's another one. It's like another Azure Wish game. Good luck finding it for anything less than an insane amount of money. So, I know that a buddy of mine was on the market for the World War I expansion to War in Europe, and it was going for an insane amount of money at the time. War in Europe goes, just because the price, you look at it right now on eBay and say it's $500, that doesn't mean you need to pay $500 for it. This is $150. In this condition, it's a $150 piece. With a pretty good box, but it's punched, I think it's a $150 piece. Can you get more for it? Sure. So Stigler mentions that 7 Days to the Rhine, and it's actually started out being called the Central Front series before they published it. And there was enough blowback from the audience that they renamed it 7 Days to the Rhine. I believe it is a Thai Bomba design, and it may well be doing a bunch of interesting things, but I have not looked at any of those games. So, John Longshore, I want to say that their computer version of Le Grand Guerre is called something different, but that's what it is. I think that's the case. And it's not available on Steam last I checked, and I have checked relatively recently. So there's not a lot of games on this Chinese. So Chinese Civil War is very complicated, okay? Because you have a civil war going on and the Japanese attack, and then that stops and the civil war resumes, and then the Japanese attack again, and the civil war sort of pauses but not exactly, and then when the Japanese are defeated and have to pull out, then the civil war resumes. So the question that you probably want to ask is how you simulate all that. How do you simulate that, or don't you? Do you just say we're going to go from 1945 to 1949 and that's it? Or are we going to start, are you starting in 1937? Are you starting in 1931? Where do you start that? Those are questions that I think you'd have to answer. I think the coin game that is coming from GMT called China's War has a fair amount of promise, because I think coin might be able to handle that reasonably well. But I think it's a design challenge that I think is going to be interesting to see how they try to solve it. So, I'm not all that constipated about Decision reusing titles for old stuff. But, there is certainly an element of caveat emptor there, right? You need to know what you're buying before you buy it. But that's true of Decision titles. It's true of everybody's titles, really. But it's true of Decision titles regardless of whether it uses an old SPI name or not, because their line ranges from some really, really good games to some games that are not very good. or have promise but are underdeveloped or whatever, right? So I mean, buyer beware. Know what you're buying. Do your research and look into stuff. And if I can help anybody answer questions on that kind of stuff, I'll be happy to. About things on specific games. I mean, I'll tell you if I have no idea too. So bear that in mind. And there's plenty of stuff that I have no idea. I mean, yes, I don't disagree with your point in that they are trying to get market exposure by reusing these older, well-known titles, and a lot of the wargame market is, let's say, older folks who are more likely to recognize these old titles, and that's true. But again, they own the titles; they can do what they want with them. It doesn't mean I have to like it necessarily, but they're within their rights to do that. So I'm going to assume that we did not just hit 160 viewers. So assume that little spike will go away. PSAC says, speaking of coin, I wonder if a distant plane can model what is going on right now. Yeah, it probably can. You might have to make some, might need some new cards or something, but yeah, it probably can. Alan Salazar mentions the inaugural game issue of S&T. It was something you can look this up on BGG, though. It was something like issue number 19 or 17 or something like that. And the first few games that they did were not mounted counters. They were just cardstock counters. Now, whether we will see an official extension of a distant plane to cover it, that I have no idea. And Brant seems to indicate that Brian Train said, I'm not doing that. So, and I wouldn't necessarily, it's his prerogative as a designer. You got to work on, as a creative person, you need to work on the stuff that you're inspired to work on, right? So, no, you shouldn't need to know the history of SPI, but you should be able to say, hey, I can look this game up on BGG and see, hey, this is this 1975 game by the same title from SPI. Is this the same game? Yes or no? People, there's places to ask those questions. You can just ask randomly on one of the Facebook groups. There's a Decision Games fan page on Facebook, believe it or not. And there's of course the Wargamers group, which is huge, and there's the SPI group, which we're both members of. So there's places to do that. So, well, it's a really hot topic. I mean, nobody's going to do that right this minute either, right? The current situation in Afghanistan. Because it's still happening, right? I mean, you got to create mechanisms to deal with something that you don't know how it's going to resolve itself in even the short term, right? So that is probably something you would need to work on yourself if you were that interested in doing that. But I think the mechanics can handle it. I don't think there's any question about that. Winter War, S&T's Winter War. They did a new version of that relatively recently. I don't know if... I don't know when that came out. But I know that there's an updated version of it. Jeff Beeler mentions, I knew about that, and I don't have that one. Manchu, the Taiping Rebellion by Richard Berg is the Taiping Rebellion. Boy, I'd love to see that. Wait a minute. It was re-implemented by the Dragon and the Cross in 2018? Well, I'll have to look at that. That I didn't know. I knew about Manchu, the Taiping Rebellion. Well, I mean, at the risk of derailment once again, I mean, I'm not going to climb too far up Decision's backside over it. Are they to what extent are they trading on the confusion? Are they benefiting materially from because they're indisputably creating confusion? That confusion works both ways, right? I mean, it could be people buying these new versions of the games because they think they're new versions of classic SPI games, or it could be people who say, I don't want to buy that because I'm confused and I don't know what the hell it is. I suspect there's elements of both going on, and I'm not sure that one necessarily dominates over the other. So maybe that's their thinking. I'm not sure that Decision is that organized to come up with a business plan of any kind. So Doug Sunset, well, yes, but the folks behind Fantasy Flight Games have been the same guy. I mean, they started the company with that game, so it's Twilight Imperium is like their pet thing. So it's not like the control over the Twilight Imperium franchise has ever left the hands of the people who originally published it. In SPI's case, that's not the case. It's passed through multiple sets of hands, at least 3, and probably some more in at least a few cases. Well, so I guess I don't want to derail. I don't, like I said, I don't really disagree with you, Stigler. And I do think it's a bad move on their part, but there's 2 separate questions. One, are they actually benefiting from that? And 2, do they believe themselves to be benefiting from that? And I'm not sure that either of those things is true. I am not sure that they have thought it through that thoroughly. I am not convinced that somebody isn't handed a project that says, "Hey, Joe, I want you to do this new version of Atlantic Wall, or the new version of Vakht-Am Rhine." And what Joe comes up with is something that looks radically different from the original Vakht-Am Rhine. That's not necessary. And then when, it gets turned over to the publishers, what do we do? We can tell Joe to get lost and redo it, but then we wasted all that time, and we don't have a thing to put in the publication slot. So it's not... I think it's not that simple, and credits the company with a level of organization that I'm not sure not only that they have, but that a lot of publishers in the wargaming space don't really have. So it's not even them. So Perfidious Albion says, speaking of most devastating wars in history, is the Mongol invasion. Depends on where you were, but sure. There aren't... So, I mean, yes, the Devil's Horseman, and that's a game that I have and that I want to play, but it is tactical battles, right? It's not really putting you in anybody's shoes other than the people on the ground in those particular battles. So, I want to say there was an S&T game on the Mongols, but you'd have to look that up on your own. You can find lists of all the S&T games on BGG, by the way. Well, so Doug's point is that there have been 4 editions of Twilight Imperium at this point, and they are all pretty different. First 2 editions are pretty similar, but this 3rd edition changes a lot, and the 4th edition changes a lot more. So, and Findle points out that Christian Peterson walked away from FFG, which, okay, so, but still, it's, at least it's with the same publishers. I mean, I had the original edition. So I've been playing that thing I actually haven't picked up nor played the 4th edition, but that's just me. Alan Salazar mentions Keep Up the Fire Boxer Rebellion. That is an interesting topic as well. Could you make an interesting war game out of it? Maybe. No, it would be challenging, but yeah, I don't think you necessarily couldn't. Empires in the Middle Ages, really kind of unique game, actually. I mean, even though there was a copy of it released, they're talking about another war in Europe too that would be released in 9 separate sub games as part of World at War magazine for 2 or 3 years or whatever it would be, and that sounds like an absolutely ridiculous project. So whether it's going to get called War in Europe, I have no idea. I don't know if that's been canned. I know there was another revision of War in Europe that was going to change even more. For what it's worth, from what I understand, the changes to War in Europe in the original Decision version are pretty much good changes. They add some things. They bring one of the idiosyncrasies of the way it was originally published is that. So it's originally published as War in the East, and then War in the East is revised in War in the East 2nd edition, and then War in the West is produced. And then they combine those two, War in the East and War in the West, into War in Europe. And if you bought War in Europe, you got three booklets, right? You got a War in the West booklet, a War in the East booklet, and a War in Europe booklet. But one of the artifacts of that original presentation is that the Russians and the Germans, I'm doing it too. The Soviets and the Germans have this production system where you got to track factories and all that stuff. The Western Allies just work off a reinforcement schedule, which is weird, right? It's like, why did they do this way when, like, War in the East uses production spirals, but War in the West uses a reinforcement schedule? It's goofy. They ditched that in the decision War in Europe. So, oh yeah, Asmodee is taking it in the shorts, from what I understand. So that's too bad. FFG's done a lot of good games too, so that makes me feel bad for FFG. Asmodee themselves don't really do anything that I'm interested in. There are corrections, and as John Sy mentions, there are corrections in errata. You can find all the corrections in errata on the internet for Triumph of Chaos. So it is something you can fix if you want to. Ken X and Perfidious Albion both mentioned the rise of the Mongol Empire in the same breath. So yeah, but they were Mongols, John. I mean, they're the Chinese. Even when we say the word Chinese, that's a lot more complicated than we necessarily typically understand here in the United States. Okay? So, what do we mean when we say Chinese? Well, do we mean the Han Chinese? Because the Han Chinese were not always... That's the traditionally, the majority in China. They weren't always ruled by Han Chinese dynasties. So... So it gets real... I mean, Chinese history is just as detailed and interesting and thorny and fascinating as Western history is. We just know it's a lot less familiar to us because we didn't learn it. How much... Okay, so I graduated high school in 1989, okay? So, how much do you think we got taught in my entire previous education, going up, all the way up to 1989, how much do you think we really learned about the Chinese? Not much. Not much at all. And more about the Japanese because we fought a war with them, but not much more. So, and to some extent this is unavoidable, but it's also regrettable and it causes some issues that we don't know enough about folks in other parts of the world, right? So as Mo points out, the Chinese language, yes, there are 5 major and a bunch of different minor languages that are all Chinese languages, right? Mandarin, which is like the sort of official state language of the People's Republic, is, not the same language as a lot of kung fu movies, which are filmed in Cantonese. There was a bit of a bit of blowback in China when Ang Lee filmed Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and instead of filming it in Cantonese, which is traditional for Hong Kong cinema, filmed it in Mandarin because Mandarin was the higher status language at the time. So, yeah, so, I mean, I didn't really learn very much other than reading that I did, which was some, right? But I probably was better educated on the subject of the Chinese than anybody else in my grammar school. Let me put it that way, because I was reading books about... I mean, I remember reading about Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers, who, of course, were in China during World War II. So, I mean, I at least knew some names and stuff like that. But, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily go by Hong Kong action cinema either, as entertaining as some of those movies are. I mean, it wasn't until college, going back to college, this was in, 2013 or 12 or something like that, when I took a history of modern China. I was like, wow, there's a lot going on here. I mean, which didn't surprise me, but I had known virtually none of that. So, which is one of the reasons why it's interesting to me to shine the light of historical examination via war games on some of the parts of topics that we are intimately familiar with as wargamers, like World War II, right? We're all pretty familiar with World War II. We can name a bunch of generals and a bunch of battles and dates and blah, 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 and tanks, and that's an authentic-looking tank. And yet we know almost nothing of the thing. I mean, somebody mentioned, I don't know if it was in this stream or in the stream with Dan some week, that World War II started in 1937, which is true. If you were in China, it absolutely started in 1937. Or did it start in 1931 when they invaded the first time? I mean, or I think that was 31. So, I mean, they had been fighting for years before we got involved, before anybody else was fighting. So, there's a whole war there that is just as interesting as the East Front or the West Front, only we can't pronounce any of the names. So, we don't really learn. I mean, that's not why, but we don't really learn any of that stuff. I mean, India has 16 or 17 official languages, of which English is one. So, I mean, even the different ways to transliterate Chinese into the Latin alphabet are very potentially confusing. Nowadays, the official system is I think closer to. The phonetic values of the letters in English are now closer than they used to be using Pinyin, if that makes any sense. I think Pinyin was super confusing for your average English speaker. Let me put it this way. That's the old system that they used to use when it was Peking, and now it's Beijing. Beijing is not exactly how they would pronounce it there, but it's closer than Peking. So, I mean, you can call that cultural arrogance if you want, and you know, that's not unfair. But, you know, every culture thinks it's the center of culture, right? So it's not, China's been around, in China's case, you know, there is an ancient civilization. Many of the innovations that we take for granted now, we like to trace back to places like Greece and Rome, but they're actually invented by the Chinese. So, technological innovations or political innovations or whatever. So, Ken X actually is right. Italian is actually more differentiable, I guess I'd say, than most European languages. And that's probably an artifact of the fact that Italy wasn't unified as a country until the mid-19th century. That's true of German to some extent, to a lesser extent, too. But that's definitely the stereotype of the French. I'm not convinced it's really true. I mean, there was one point, not that long ago, in which French was the international language of diplomacy. If you were a diplomat, you were expected to speak not English, but French. It's been a little while. So, yeah, so there's traditional... I mean, Chinese is a difficult language to learn for English speakers for two reasons. One, it's very differently constructed type of language that is very different from European languages. But the other thing is the writing, which is incredibly complex. And there's... it's considered one of the most challenging languages to learn, both written and spoken. There's traditional Chinese script and simplified Chinese script. Simplified is what the People's Republic uses. Traditional is what the Taiwanese use. That is probably oversimplified, but that's the nutshell version of that. So I never at any point attempted to try to learn Chinese. Like, no, I'm good. Which is too bad. I mean, because there's if you can speak and read Chinese, there's probably a lot of interesting sources that you could do design work from that are not available in English. So, They should make a movie about Garibaldi, actually. But then again, whenever anybody says Garibaldi, I think of Babylon 5. So that's just me. All right, so let me. We're about out of time. If anybody's got super last minute things, please speak up now. Let me mention again, if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the links in the video description. There are links to the Patreon, there are links to the Ko-Fi thing, and there are links to the merch store. The merch is very nice. We're not wearing the merch today, but this is GMT's merch, not mine. There are Chinese designers. Leonard To has designed a game called the War of the Suns, for example, that was published by MMP. Don't forget, 10 p.m., that's the scheduled time, tomorrow night, 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, for 1 hour, we will be streaming Pavlov's House, the Steam version of Pavlov's House. Probably I will die immediately. We might not even last an hour. And then on Wednesday, we will be streaming here at 6:30 Eastern Daylight Time with Dan Pencaldi from No Enemies Here. If I haven't mentioned it, and I didn't, intro music by Mr. Dan Pencaldi. The topic on Wednesday is unit scale. This show, I don't have a topic next weekend, but or next Monday, but don't forget that there will be a giveaway next Monday on next Monday's stream. Not 100% sure on how I'm going to handle that. There's apps that will expedite that. I may just do a draw number thing because I don't want to. I may or may not have the desire to try to install add-ons or get Streamlabs working or any of that. So that may be simulcast on Twitch if I can get that working. I make no promises. It will definitely be here. What else do we have? And we have an unboxing. So unboxings are returning. There were a couple weeks when I just didn't get to it. So this Thursday we have an unboxing of ASL Starter Kit Bonus Pack number 2, which is the latest from the ASL Starter Kit line. And then I have a thing queued up for next week as well. But that might get pushed out. We'll see. It will be late on Thursday because I'm coordinating with the Armchair Dragoons. So 4 p.m. will be when the unboxing video hits. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll hope to get that sale video up fairly soon. I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. We hit a high of 95, which is outstanding. So I'd like to thank everyone once again, and we'll see you all again very